Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite places, my favorite topics of all time, Iceland. Here it is from space. Um, Moving on to our second week now, we're going to be talking about our first named medieval author, and a text we can really dig our teeth into a little bit. I have plenty to say about what we read last week. I've already said some of it on the videos, but this week I want to talk about an author and a very important book that was extremely important to Tolkien in ways that we'll see. But anyway, Iceland, medieval Iceland. There's lots of things I could say about it. Let's just take a look. I don't know. Okay. I did not take this image. I've been here. This is a place called Kirkjufell. Probably midsummer. It literally does look like this. Like here, watch, check it out. Bam! All of a sudden, we're in the winter. And there's aurora borealis, snow. It's beautiful, frozen stuff. So yes, Iceland does look like this. I'm going to guess this right here is a midsummer midnight. So I lived in Reykjavik for about a year and a half. And I don't know if you know this, but close enough to the Arctic Circle, the sun never quite sets in the summertime, although winters are pretty hellish, but it never quite sets in the summertime. So you end up with these extended like 6-7 hour sunsets. So it just looks like this all night. You never get tired. It's beautiful. Iceland is amazing. It's an amazing place, even in the winter, because you get to look at amazing things like this all the time. Yeah, that's a place called Kirkjufell. Anywho, Iceland. When does Iceland blip into human history? Relatively recently. So I'm going to move forward from the beginning of human history in Iceland to our author for this week, other than Tolkien. His name is Snorri Sturluson, but let's get there by marching through a very slapshod, quick Icelandic history. So here's a little picture of Scandinavia. So in the 870s, Norway started to emerge as a kingdom, whereas before, it had been kind of moving in this direction for a few decades, but it really started to seem to codify itself as something like a nation state under a king. And there were a lot of, relatively rich landowning farmers who were not happy with this situation at all. So starting in the early 870s, relatively, and I say relative because wealth is wealth in this case in medieval Europe is very relative. Anyway, very relatively powerful people who opposed the king started to flee, and they sort of took advantage of stories of a unoccupied island, very large unoccupied island to the northwest. Northwest. And so in 871 or two, a guy named Ingolfur Arason is credited as being the first Norwegian landowner to bring his whole family, a relatively large settlement party, and to settle in Iceland permanently for the first time. And that the place where he landed and set up shop is what has become basically Reykjavik, which is over here. And he was the first of many, many hundreds who came. The thing about Iceland I always find interesting, among so many other things, is that it was totally uninhabited and had never been inhabited before the Icelanders got there. So we have a complete record of the history of a place, uniquely in all the world, where humans didn't kill off a population, or we can be sure that they did not kill off another population of humans to come to reside there. Although, in a medieval history called Íslendingabók, am I right about that? Yeah, is that the Íslendingabók? I mean, you don't care, but I'm pretty sure it's Íslendingabók. Íslandsbók. Doesn't matter. It might be Landsnámabók. Who cares? You don't care. Anyway, the settlement is the story of the settlement is told, and it's said that when the Norwegians got there, when the Norse got there, they found one little house with a bunch of strange Irish people in it that went around talking about their papa. And they left a bunch of gold crosses and stuff. And so the way that the story is told, and this is just sort of hearsay by a guy who told the story about 2 centuries later. Anyway, they just sort of killed these guys off, like there were 4 of them or something. So what's funny about that, horrible, is that they were probably Irish monks who wanted extreme seclusion and so somehow migrated up to the southern shore of Iceland. I don't know. That's the only possible other inhabitants that were there. Here's a picture of Ingolfur Arason. And if you ever go to Reykjavik and there's a huge statue of this guy holding up a sword, that's him. This is an improbably small boat. Maybe it's a smaller boat that came off one of the larger ocean sailing vessels that the Northerners were so good at making. Another thing I want to mention too is that this is often called something like the time of the Vikings. Viking is just a horrible misnomer. A Viking was almost a specific occupation. Not all of the people that lived in the medieval North were Vikings. A Viking was the sort of person that in the summer in the clear and unfrozen waters went off to raid. Yeah, they went on Viking trips. In fact, there's even a sort of verb. It's like to go Viking. And a Viking, by the way, just meant something like a bay man. That is like a bay. They came in the bays. They stole stuff and they left. So that is definitely not all of the northern people, many of whom were occupied in all kinds of occupations. And the Vikings often spent the rest of the year home with their families, farming and chilling out. Well, not really. Iceland is a pretty inhospitable place. So here is a picture. This is a place called Thingvellisbær, which is like a national farmstead, I think is what that kind of means. And it's like, it's a recreation based on some architectural archaeological findings in a different location. But this is more or less probably what a 9th century era longhouse would have looked like, a settlement, in other words. One thing that's missing in this picture that was probably here in abundance when the first Norwegians came and became the first Icelanders were trees. Iceland used to have a fair amount of trees, but they became relatively quickly deforested in this settlement process. So anyway, this is a sort of possible design based on reconstructed archaeological evidence of a Viking era. Now I have to use it anyway. Longhouse. Somebody told me once that, or somebody told me that Game of Thrones shot here for some reason. I don't remember seeing that in the show. So anyway, inside this place, a classic sort of old medieval Icelandic longhouse, you see the sort of cramped and stark conditions. Many families probably occupied this dwelling. These are probably their sleeping locations. So I have some pictures that I took myself once. By the way, I didn't take these. I have been to this place, but I didn't get pictures that were this good, so I stole them from the internet. Anyway, the sleep, it's almost as if the Icelanders must have been like child size, because they don't give them too much room to sleep. Imagine sleeping sort of lengthwise on here. It's about 4 feet across. I don't know what they did, curl up? So anyway, a little deeper in, you get a place where well, there's another way to put it, women's work was probably done. That is, in the important work, like making clothing and weaving and spinning on this cool loom-weighted, simple loom here. I have another picture to get with women in here. Did I put it in? No, I didn't. Recreating kind of the work, and it's a fair amount of space. It's cozy, but it's relatively dark. You could imagine, though, in summers, there's every advantage. You go outside and it's beautiful. In winters, though, you're stuck in this place for a very long time. Our author was probably born in something not dissimilar to this. He was born into a relatively powerful family. His parents had connections to some of everybody did, but his parents had relatively close connections to some of the more powerful settlers in a generation several years before. So Iceland, I said, was settled in the early 870s and forward. So fast forward about 300 years. Technological conditions aren't much better. So in a house something like that, and near this location here, this is a town called Borg, in an area called Reykjaholt, which is north of Reykjavik. This is what it looks like today. A man named Snorri Sturluson, or Snorri, son of Sturla, was born. So Icelandic names, by the way, are just patronymic. So Snorri is his name. Sturluson is not a last name. It's just his father's name plus son. There's not many last names in Iceland. There are a few. Some of my teachers there were Guðrun Nordal, which is a name that passes down, like our last names, and another guy named Torfi Tullinius. So there's another name. That one's Danish, but it passes down. But for the most part, you don't have a name that passes down. It's your name, and then your father's name plus son or dóttir. So Snorri Sturluson was born in do I know this for sure? I have a note over here, 1178. Yeah. In this town called Borg, there's a picture of him. This is a picture from a modern edition. Actually, it's not that modern. It's like 100 years old, but it's a woodcut. I don't know why they make him look like this funny little guy. We have no idea what he looked like. He might as well have looked like this. Snorri Sturluson went to school in a place called Oddi. There was some kind of monastery slash small school there, which probably looked a lot like that longhouse I showed you a minute ago. This is what's there today. It's a little church. So obviously much later. Christianity, by the way, came into Iceland in 999, although the Icelanders like to round up to 1000, in the most Icelandic way possible. You might not expect what I mean by that. They voted it in. No blood, no nothing, though there might have been a few skirmishes before 999 that sort of invited them to join the rest of Scandinavia and voted in. There was this sort of crusading king in Norway named Olav, who was busy sort of killing the Norwegians, like beating the Norwegians into conversion. And the Icelanders looked at that and they were like, "So guys, how about we just adopt this now before and get it over with, so we don't get our heads beat in?" And everybody like said, "Yay!" And that was it. They converted in bulk by vote in 999. So these churches, there were churches there in Snorri's time. Probably there was a little chapel of some sort, but it probably looked a lot like that turf hall and not like this modern day wood church. So anyway, in Oddi, we'll come back to Oddi in a minute because it has to do with what we read today, what we're reading for this week, maybe. So Snorri was already a member of a sort of relatively powerful family, but by 1215 he had gained enough power, political power in the country, to be named lawman or lögsögumaður, which is there was that, like I implied, Iceland worked in an extreme democratic parliamentary sort of function. Now, parliament doesn't quite work, but democratic function. There were things called thingi, it's called a thing, but it was just like a little local parliament that happened in the different districts of Iceland routinely through the year. And then once a year there would be something called the Alþingi, which is the all gathering, the all thing, the all parliament, which happened in this place, Þingvellir. By the way, in Iceland today, they still have an Alþingi. It's their parliament. So anyway, in this beautiful place called Þingvellir, anybody who wanted to from anywhere in Iceland would convene, and they would decide on major issues and drown witches, I'm not kidding, and all kinds of stuff like that. And so there was a sort of presiding official, and it was the lögsögumaður, or lawman. By the way, my name, Lemons, actually comes from this word lawman, lögman, from like a Scottish sort of, a Norse borrowing into Scottish. It's kind of a weird story. Anyway, so Þingvellir, Snorri Sturluson was sort of presiding over Icelandic politics for a period of about 3 years. Þingvellir, by the way, is this gorgeous, weird place. It's split with all of these water-filled gorges. And it's literally the place at which the tectonic plates, the North American and the European tectonic plates, are parting ways. So you could sort of hop back and forth over these gorges and sort of be like, Europe, America, Europe, America. It's kind of fun. I recommend you try that out. There he is, sort of dictating the law. So, and among other accomplishments of this very important Icelander, probably the most important Icelander of his age, for many reasons, not just being the lögsögumaður, he was also a diplomat. So at this time, a young king had taken power in Norway, named Hákon, with a sort of advisor named Earl Skúli. And Snorri Sturluson got in very well with this guy, Earl Skúli, and made many trips to Norway and back. And basically convinced Norway to change its policy towards Iceland, essentially to leave Iceland alone, where before his intervention, it seemed as if King Hákon was going to launch a fleet against Iceland and essentially take it over, because Iceland had been fiercely independent until then. Remember, basically Iceland began as a population of outlaws from the Norwegian kings. Another thing about Iceland is that, and this is true up to this day, linguistically, Icelandic is very conservative. So already the language of Iceland was changing from the continental forms of Old Norse. And it remains to this day extremely conservative, such that a modern Icelander can pick up a 10th, 11th century text in Old Norse, Old Icelandic, I should say, and read it fluently. Not so a Norwegian, a Swede, or a Dane, whose languages parted and moved very differently from each other and from this old form of the language. Speaking of that language, You know what? Let's kill Snorri real quick. So this is in the 1220s and 30s that Snorri is managing to sort of puppeteer and manipulate Scandinavian politics to Iceland's benefit, and also to the benefit of his faction and party in Iceland. Well, around 1240, Earl Skuli, his sort of inside man in Norwegian politics, died. And everything turned against Snorri in a hurry. Haakon put together this hit squad, basically, and sent them to kill Snorri or take him alive. They found him hiding in something like a basement underneath the house. And did I write down where this was? Sorry, I didn't. Probably in Reykholt, somewhere near his borg where he lived. At any rate, they found him, and they came in with swords drawn, and Snorri famously said, "You shall not strike," and then they struck, and he died. So before he died, and somewhere in his tempestuous career, he wrote some of the most important pieces of Norse literature that we have, among which is a history of the kings of Norway, and much besides, called the Heimskringla, or the Ring of the World. Sadly, after it was copied, this manuscript burned in, now I don't remember, 1780? I'm not sure. It burned, though. We lost the entire single manuscript of the Heimskringla, except for this one page, which for some reason survives. I don't quite have the story on the tip of my tongue about why it survived. Maybe it was out for display. So we have one page, but we have copies. So we have the Heimskringla, and we have the text that we read for today, something called the Edda. So you're like, wait a minute, didn't I already read something called the Edda? Well, there's a problem there, and I talk about it in the video chat that I had last Thursday, but I'll give a short version now. So we're reading something called the Edda, which it's a great book. It's great for many reasons, but for our purposes, it's great for supplying, in a nutshell, something like a total picture of Old Norse mythology. It's almost all there. There's some references here and there in other texts that seem to lie in myths outside of what he compiled into the Edda, into parts of the Edda. But it's a sort of one-stop shopping if you want to learn about the myths of the Aesir and the Old North, Thor, Odin, etc. Why is it called the Edda? Well, it actually seems to have been called the Edda, even though he had names for each little part of it. We're going to read something, the prologue, so-called, and then something called the Gylfaginning, or the I don't know what I want to call it, the joking or the play of with Gylfi, the Gylfaginning. Anyway, Edda seems like one of the going ideas for what Edda means is that it kind of looks like it could mean the stuff taught in Odi, as if it's to sort of remember that place I said there's the church there, the place where Snorri went to school and learned how to write and read and became educated. Edda might be sort of like a curriculum for Odi. So whatever the case is, he called his book the Edda, or it's somebody very near his time did. And it contained quotations to a lot of very, very old Norse poetry. Sometime, maybe just a few hundred years ago, they found a manuscript that contained all of those poems that he quoted from, and many besides. And they didn't have any names. They were just there in this one manuscript. People said, oh, okay, these are the poems that Snorri quoted in the Edda. So, and then this is a weird jump for me in my mind anyway. They said, well, let's call this the Edda too, or we'll call it the Edukvæði, which means like, in Icelandic it means like the poetry of the Edda. And then after a while it just became also called the Edda. So now we're left with these problematic names, and we say that what we read last week is part of the poetic Edda, and what we're reading this week is the prose Edda, which is kind of a silly thing to say because it's just the Edda, and the other one was kind of stole the name. So he wrote these texts, the Edda. He also wrote another text based on where he is, and who would know this sort of thing. He wrote the saga, my favorite saga by a landslide, the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson. It's called Egil Saga. Egil Skallagrimsson is just an amazing, weird character, one of the first in the first generation of settlers, and also an ancestor of Snorri Sturluson himself through his mother's side. the so-called Myrmen. They also lived in Borg, which is near where Snorri was born. And so some people think that Snorri also wrote this very important and one of the longer sagas. Egil Skallagrimsson is he's a sight. I mean, well, he would have been. He seems to have been something in the line of 7 feet tall with some sort of strange elephantiasis in his head. He just had a gigantic cranium, and everybody commented on this. And in fact, his cranium, well, I don't want to spoil it, but his cranium has sort of an afterlife even after he's dead, doing what he did when he was alive, which was kill the crap out of people. He was a frickin' psychopath, and he started his killing when he was like 10. This saga is amazing. Not only did he start killing tons of people in horrible ways when he was like 10. He also started composing when he was very young, apparently, some of the most beautiful poetry ever written in Icelandic. So he's simultaneously a psychopathic serial killer and the sort of, I guess I wouldn't call him a Shakespeare, maybe I'll call him the Chaucer of Icelandic literature. His poems are kind of funny sometimes. Anyway, here's the poem. The reason why the Edda exists is poetry. So I'm just as a sort of flash intro to the sound, shape, and workings of Icelandic medieval literature, I'm going to talk about one of his poems and then another poem that's interesting, and then we'll get to why Snorri wrote the Edda. Let me check my time. I really want to knock this out under 10 more minutes. Okay, I'm going to read this out loud and then fire through this thing and then put this up if you want to kind of go through this little display of how an Old Icelandic poem works. By the way, this is not like the poetry you read in the Völvspá. The Völvspá, I keep mispronouncing that, I'm sorry, there's two ways. Völvspá. This is something called skaldic poetry, skaldukvæði. So, which is a little different from Eddic poetry. It's more complex, very complex, which we'll talk about a little bit. I'm going to read this in something like Old Icelandic, what we think to be Old Icelandic pronunciation. Although if you talk to an Icelander today, they'll just pronounce this as if it were written in modern Icelandic. So if I screw up, it's probably because I'm letting my modern Icelandic interfere a little bit. But in something like Egil Skallagrimsson's own pronunciation, perhaps, Gekk sas óðris ekki, jarmans banni snarla, þreklundar felltundar, þorvrig nú stórum, jöð grör en verðum, vínunerv mínum, helnár þess þar hulja, harm agatum barma. So what does this mean? And how does it mean it? It's very complex. Let's check it out. So one thing to notice is that this poem is put together on a pattern of alliteration. So any vowel, it's almost like saying any absent consonant can alliterate with any other absent consonant. And consonants, this symbol represents the th sound. And this little guy, by the way, represents the th sound. And then don't worry about these. Anyway, these thorns, they're runes, by the way, alliterate together, and so do these V's and so do these H's. So A takes liberties with poetry. So you might notice there isn't one here. That's not considered a fault. It's considered a little variation. Unless you consider that the y is kind of a hiding e. Anywho, another thing that has to happen in this kind of poetry is there has to be rhymes internal. Gekk, ekki, jarl, snarl, freklundaður, felþundar, and these hit on significant syllables too. Okay, and so you sort of see some variation with that in the second half, which is sort of called Egil Skallagrimsson's signature. All right, so I'm adding a little modern punctuation to this so we can get a better handle on how this means what it means. Now brace yourself if this doesn't make total sense to you right off the bat. Where to put myself? Down here for now. I don't know what to say. We're just going to do it kind of quick though, because this isn't really the point of the course. I just wanted to give you a hint of how much that was sort of put into this. By the way, most of this was orally transmitted. It wasn't written down until Snorri Sturluson's age. So the 12th century was when the stories, poems, and tales from, say, the 9th century were started to be written down, actually written down. So there, behind this is, behind this poem is, remember that this poem was kept somehow orally, in oral tradition for something like 300 years. This testifies to something like the medieval memory, but also the Icelanders, as this guy Saxo Grammaticus says in his intro to a history of the Danes, he says that Icelanders had just ridiculous, phenomenal memory. He says probably because they were in their houses for so many months out of the year, they just worked in their brains. So anyway, he goes, Gek. He who fears nothing goes. Each little part of this adds something, but not necessarily in the order our English minds would like, because we learn a little bit that we needed for syntax earlier later. So the Earl, Jarlsman's Bani, the Earl's Bane goes. Notice how the syntax builds itself up by sort of whipping, curling back, and finishing things that were left unfinished from before. Swiftly he goes. The Earl's Bane, who fears nothing, goes. The bold one fell. Where does this go? I put it in parentheses. Those aren't there in the original manuscripts. It's just I put that there to help. But only the syntax, only the grammar tells you that this can't be linking up into anything before, hence my different color. And then of Odin. How do you know Thundar is Odin? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. Thorvald, finally we know who he is. Thorvald. See, we finally get the subject of the sentence long after two other sentences have been basically begun. Thorvald, the Earl's Bane, who fears nothing, goes swiftly. The bold one fell. Who's that? Well, Thorvald, Thorolfr is probably referring to, and I don't remember exactly the context, but Thorolfr was Egil's brother who died young, into Odin's loud din, which is what, by the way? Odin's loud din turns out to be a kenning, the din of Odin. It's battle. Because if you know who Odin is, you know that he likes to stoke and slink around battles and sort of poach dead warriors for his personal army of the dead, which he'll launch at Ragnarok. So Odin in battle, Odin's din is battle. We only know that if we know something about Odin. Furthermore, we only know that Thundar is Odin if we know yet more about Odin. So similar grammatical contortions happen in this second stanza. I'm going about it a different way. I'm going to give the sentences, but notice how you construct the sentences in a sort of weave with another sentence. Old Icelandic poetry, in other words, was sometimes building two sentences at once, interchanging the parts, and it's the grammar, the complex grammar of Old Germanic languages, which is retained in Old Norse, Old Icelandic, which allows this to happen. Earth grows over my noble brother, Jöð græir of mínum ágætum barma, near the Vinunær, I guess I'd say. But I have to bury, and verðum hulja harm. And yet there's another little sentence buried inside of this, which doesn't really correspond to the other two, but kind of pings off of this other little micro sentence that was snuck into the poetry from up above. So not only, in other words, do we have a tangle of poetic features like the alliterating syllables and the internal rhyme, but the syntax performs this majestic interweave. It sort of reminds me of terms that are in Beowulf for what the Beowulf poet is doing, what a Sholp or a poet in old Anglo-Saxon or Old English context is doing with words. They say wordum riksland, to you could kind of say to rive, weave, or interchange words. You could say trade them back and forth, but in a sort of commerce, but it also kind of implies a weave. So Old Icelandic poetry is that times 20. So this poem is telling the story perhaps of Egil Skallagrimsson's brother who died in battle young, in a sort of political skirmish that Egil himself gets sort of caught up in. But it tells it in a way, in just a few stanzas, it tells it by sort of narrating it directly, talking about in completely different sentences buried in those other sentences how Egil felt about it, and what he's doing in response. It's pretty immense. I don't have much time, so actually I'm going to skip this other poem, which I was going to talk about this poem. It's actually seems like it may be the first European poem composed in the New World, but some other time maybe. It's from a different saga entirely. The question to actually go back to this is, well, how am I going to, let's say I'm a newbie, a kid maybe, and I want to learn how to do this kind of poetry. Well, you could go the tried and true method of just learning from poets, from skalds, that have been doing this for hundreds of years. But in Snorri's time, we're entering a very literate phase of Icelandic culture. And Snorri, who was a poet himself, and who knew that poetry was sort of part of a cultural capital that would maybe advance you in society and in political life, poetry was important. in many different aspects of the world. So Snorri wanted to sort of instruct, Snorri Sturluson wanted to sort of leave some manner of instruction for people who were getting into this. We don't know all of the motives why he wanted to write this book, but he wanted to help people figure out how to write poetry like this, understand poetry like this. And one of the ingredients that is sort of core to interpreting this poetry are mythological references, like Thunter. Why is Odin Thunter, for instance? This is relatively spare. There's some poems actually drop lots of mythological references into this. But if we don't know Thunter, if we don't know who he is, and if we don't know why his din is sort of referring to battle, then we're not going to get this poem. So we need to know mythology. And, you know, if you just pick about 10, 20 skaldic verses at random, all of a sudden something like a complete knowledge of old northern mythology is wanted just to do a basic interpretation of what these poems mean. Hence, from Snorri, this text called the Gylfaginning. So he wrote 3 major texts, and there's a prologue that seems to go with it, and we're not really sure. Sometimes these texts don't all appear in the same place or in the same order, or all together in a manuscript, but he seems to have written 3 texts, something called the Gylfaginning, which we talked about and we're going to read, something called the Skaldskaparmal, which means something like a discourse on the language of poetry or the craft of poetry or something like that. And then something else called the Haftatau, which is means something like a catalog of meters. So basically the ingredients of making a poem like this. The alliterative schemes that are possible and maybe allowable. The rhyming schemes that are possible and allowable. And then in the Gylfaginning and in some of the Skaldskaparmal, the poetic language. That you need to, and the mythology that you need to know to unpack it. So let's go through a little bit. I have some images of this thing. This is the Edda in a nutshell. It seems to be something like the purpose of this thing was to instruct in how to understand and compose poetry. But for us and for many, it also is handy as something like a manual of Nordic mythology. Because that's what one has to know in order. That's not necessarily what poems are about, right? That's the Egil's poem was about the death of his brother. In fact, the spectrum of emotional content and human interests and topics in these poems are as broad as the rainbow, right? But the language of these poems is mythological. You sort of project or analogize things that are happening to you in the present against this backdrop of mythological stories that seems to have followed around the Germanic people, at least since their first blip in literary history, which is Tacitus's this Romans from like the 60s AD. He wrote this this book, this ethnography called the Germania, about the Germanic peoples. And there already we see Tacitus records the names of some of our familiar gods, from your Marvel Thor movie. Okay, so we're going to read this week. So I'm tempted to say more, but I'm not going to say much more. We're going to read parts of the Edda. I just wanted to show you these ridiculous pictures. This is from a manuscript from, well, down here it says 1660, yeah? So there it is, a 1660, so long after Snorri was dead, by 420 years after he died, this manuscript was created, and it's illustrated just ridiculously, but I love it. It's got images of things that you're going to see in Gylfaginning. Here's Gylfi interviewing these strange stacked kings, all of which look like Odin. By the way, if you see dudes with one eyes in medieval Scandinavian literature, it's Odin in some way, shape, or form. And then here you have the primordial cow sort of licking the ice away from the primordial giant. There's Odin and his birds, Hugin and Munin, his crows. There he is riding his horse Sleipnir, the story of which we're going to learn all of these. There's Thor, check out that hammer. There's the broken end of it, but what? Yeah, so imagine, you can imagine that thing. Although I guess that sort of looks like the thing that Thor busts into Thanos in the end of the movie. Notice too, we have some runes down here. I didn't really talk much about them. Yeah, those are hardly runes, are they? Some of those things, man. Some of these, this looks like zh in Russian. I don't know. Some of these runes are suspicious to me, but I don't know too much about it. There's, what's his name? Heimdall with the horn. Oh, I love this guy. This is Utr. The skiing Norse, the skiing us. Us is the name of the gods. Aesir is the plural. So look, there's these skis down here. Anyway, these are just, there's Loki. There's this little goat thing nibbling. Yeah, there's the Yggdrasil. Here's somewhere in here is my favorite character ever, Ratatusker. There he is. He's like this nasty squirrel that runs up and down the tree, pissing off the dragon and the eagle that are on top of it. Yeah, and here is a famous scene that we'll see, and it was talked about in the Poetic Edda, where Loki shows this blind guy in this sort of dumb game that they're playing, which is so Balder, the son of Odin. This is like the kind of super Christ figure slash Superman of Old Norse mythology, and he famously dies. He's invulnerable to everything but one thing, and so they play apparently this stupid game, which is like all the gods are like, let's throw stuff at Balder and like watch it bounce off his manly chest. But mistletoe, oh, it'll go right through him. And Loki gives away this little secret, and so here's some mistletoe transecting poor Balder. Anyway, these are some really bizarre little comic booky images of the mythology that Tolkien loved so much, and which is so influential in his construction of Middle-earth, which makes it so influential, I think, in our understanding of the medieval, despite the relatively geopolitically limited range of this material in the medieval world. If you are concerned with the medieval world as this grand sum total of like, well, Europe and Scandinavia all together, where, you know, history in some other respects has taught us to privilege like French and English and Italian history. Tolkien did not privilege French and Italian Southern Mediterranean history. He privileged an image of, or privileged, I guess I should say, he didn't privilege, he just loved the North. And that love of the North, I think, privileges the way that we, privileges the North and the appearance and the sort of imagery and the memory of the North in our understanding of, popular understanding of the medieval today. Well, this basic introduction to this guy and his work, some key factors there is that this is a work with essentially a poetic purpose, an educational, like a didactic purpose, and the relevance of this, I think, will be I need not be mentioned. So I have you reading this in something called the Valaquenta that Tolkien wrote, very much in imitation of the even the style of presentation, I think, of this. So anyway, I'll let you guys go and I'll let you go read it. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking around, and I will see you guys soon. Farewell.